Hello. Today I'm going to show you how to fill out a vampire story page. It's very simple. Let's take a look at it. Now, for every short story or poem that we read in this class, I'm going to ask you to fill out this vampire story page. You have to do one of three things. So, in fact, let me bring this back and let me set it up. Let's present it to you so you can see what I'm looking at. That would help. Okay, so now you're looking at the vampire story page. It's very simple. Now, to fill out the top is easy. Put your name, put the date, put the period of the class. Simple. Title of the source. That is what the poem or the short story. So the first poem we're going to be reading is called Der Vampire. So here I would type in Der Vampire. So allow me to do that and show you. Der Vampire. Good. The poem, or is it a poem or a short story? This is a poem. The author, I figured that out, and the year published, I figured that out. I believe it's 1747, and the author is Assenfelder. Okay, let's continue. You have one of three things that you have to do after you read that poem. You are going to choose one of the following three positions. One, you believe it is a vampire story. Okay. You must have reasons that you believe it's a vampire story, characteristics that they show, things that you know, hey, vampires do that vampires float, vampires turn into bats, whatever it is. You have to have reasons for it. So you have to give me those three reasons. And more importantly than that, you have to give me a supporting quote. You have to quote from the poem or the story to show how you came up with that reason. You have to give me a second reason and a second quote and a third reason and a third quote. So if you are choosing that it is a vampire story, you give me three reasons and three supporting quotes. Done. The next thing you can choose that it is not a vampire story. And you have to do the same thing for me. You have to give me three reasons why you think it is not a vampire story. Give me the reason why for first reason, and then a quote. Give me a second reason, and then a quote, and a third reason, and a quote. Now, again, you're not pulling these reasons out of thin air. You're pulling them from the poem or the short story after reading it and after highlighting and taking notes and annotating and all that. Investigating, analyzing this poem left and right, you realize this isn't a vampire poem for these reasons. Blank happened, another thing. So you write those reasons in there and you give me the quote to support it. And then lastly, the third choice you can have is that you believe it's not a vampire story, but you can see why some people might mistake it for one. And give me those three reasons as well. Give me a reason, give me a quote, give me a reason, another quote, and a reason and another quote. Everybody see this? Three things that you can choose from. You only do one of the three. Whether you believe it is a vampire story, fine. Whether you believe it isn't a vampire story, also fine, as long as you're giving it three reasons and three quotes. And lastly, that you think it is not a vampire story, but you can see why somebody might think it is because they don't know enough about vampires. And by the end of, in a couple of weeks of this class, after going over vampire characteristics in your research, after going through the research of how to kill a vampire, how to become a vampire, types of vampires, and even more, you're going to become an expert on what makes a vampire or not. So filling out these sheets should be quite simple. Allow me to show you some examples of students who have done this and have done this correctly. So one of the poems we're going to be reading is called The Bride of Corinth. All right, so they filled this out. They have The Bride of Corinth. It's a poem. The author is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and this was published in the year of 1797. Now, this student chose, as you can see, the first option. So they chose that this is a vampire story. We'll go over it in a second. And they gave three reasons and three quotes. Now, notice they believe it's not a vampire story. They left that blank because they believe it is a vampire story. And they also left the third option blank, which is that they believe it's not a vampire story, but they can see why some people might believe it's one. That's blank as well. They chose the top reason, the top example or choice. They believe it is a vampire story, and they gave me three reasons and three quotes. So let's take a look at their reasons. One, first reason, I believe it is a vampire story. I believe this because of how in the beginning the young girl told her lover to stay away and talked about she is not of God anymore and that she could not go to heaven. You don't know this yet, but in your research, you're going to realize that vampires cannot touch anything that has to do with God. They can't touch churches. They can't touch Bibles, crosses, holy water, anything having to do with God. Okay, so look at the quote that they give. The vampire actually says in the story, "Draw not nigh, O youth, afar remain. Rapture now can never smile on me." So, rapture means going to heaven after you die. So she says, rapture now can never smile on me, meaning she is barred from heaven. She is out of God's grace, which is good proof that she's a vampire. Number two, I believe it's a vampire story. I believe this because of how the young lady was not able to accept the silver gift. Another thing you're going to find out in your research is that vampires can't touch silver of any kind. It can't touch them. They can't touch it. Take a look at the quote that they gave. And the silver chalice would the youth. And she says, that is not for me, yet I beg of thee. So he tries to give her a silver chalice as a gift. And she says, that is not for me. I cannot touch that. He gives a quote to support that. And his third reason why he believes it is not a vampire story. He says, why he believes it is a vampire story, pardon me. He believes it is a vampire story because she levitated later in the poem. And she was excited when the clock struck 12. Two things you're going to learn, more things that you're going to learn about vampires, their characteristics. They have the power to levitate or float. And two, their powers are strongest at midnight. We're also going to find out that their powers are weakest at midnight. So this character in the story actually levitates, and at midnight, she gets very excited and stronger, which shows her powers are at her strongest, which proves to him that this was a vampire story. So again, he gives three reasons why, and he gives three quotes to support it. Notice also that he gives full sentences. He doesn't just say she flies or she levitates. He says, I believe this is a vampire story because in the story she levitates. So make sure you're giving full sentences as well. And also make sure your quotes are cited correctly, that you're quoting them correctly, that you have the correct words and you're spelling everything correctly so that later when you're writing your essay, you can take the quotes directly from these format pages. Let's take a look at another example of a vampire story page. Okay, this is number 2. Now, this is another poem that we're going to read. It's called The Old Woman of Berkeley, also a poem written by Robert Southey, and this was published in the year 1798. Now, notice this student, did not believe it was a vampire story, so they left that blank. Let's take a look at number 2. They believe that it is not a vampire story. So that's the one that they chose. Look, so they do not believe it is a vampire story. That's blank. They believe it's not a vampire story. There's 3 reasons and 3 quotes. And lastly, this one has to be blank because they filled out that it's not, and that's the mistaken one. The fact that you can see that someone could make the mistake and think it is a vampire story, but it's really not. So this person believes it's not a vampire story and that no mistake should be made. Let's take a look at their reasons. 1. I believe it is not a vampire story. I believe this because in the earlier stages of the poem, the woman talks about her witchcrafts, thus implying that she is a witch and not a vampire. And take a look at this quote that he gives, my witchcrafts to atone. That's the character actually admitting that she is a witch. And if you're a witch, you're not a vampire, right? So that's one reason right there. Let's continue on. I believe it's not a vampire story. I believe this because she dies. Vampires do not die, so her death must mean that she's not a vampire. That's another interesting thing. Vampires are immortal. Okay, they can be killed, but they don't just lay down and die of old age, right? And take a look at the supporting quote. Quote, the old woman of Berkeley laid her down, and her eyes grew deadly dim. Short came her breath, and the struggle of death did loosen every limb. So this woman actually lays down and dies, which is another indication that she can't be a vampire since vampires live forever. And let's look at our third reason why they believe it is not a vampire story. And look, it's in full sentences. I believe it is not a vampire story. I believe this because the old woman was taken by the devil. Vampires just come back to life and get right back into the line of work and killing and eating and drinking humans. Now, the quote he gives is the devil, he flung her from her horse and he leapt up before and away like the lightning speed they went, and she was seen no more. So he gives 3 reasons why he believes it's not a vampire story, and he gives 3 quotes. So again, I'm going to go over this one more time. This is a very simple assignment that you have to do. After reading a short story or a poem, you are going to then come back here to this page, and you're going to decide whether you believe it was a vampire story, give 3 reasons and 3 quotes to support. You're going to say whether it was not a vampire story, and you're going to give 3 reasons, right? And tell me whether or not you believe why it's not with your 3 quotes. And of course, the last one is that you believe it is not a vampire story, but you can see how somebody could make that mistake. If you have any questions or problems, ask me. But again, the most important thing that you're doing is giving reasons why you believe this. Now, you can't get this wrong. You're the one giving quotes for it. So whatever you believe, as long as you have quotes to support them, that's A-okay. Fantastic job, everybody. Thank you very much.